In this video, we'll show you how to change the rear axle bearing on your Chevy Silverado. You can find it on CarParts.com via the link in the description. For safety reasons, we strongly suggest watching our video on how to jack your Chevy Silverado safely. Now you need to remove the brake system. To do so, we recommend watching our video, How to Replace the Rear Brakes Chevy Silverado. You'll now need to remove the ABS sensor from the wheel knuckle. Using a ratchet and a Torx T30 socket, unscrew the ABS sensor's retaining bolt. Using a flathead screwdriver, pry it out of its slot. In order to remove the rear axle shaft, you need to disengage it from the differential. Place a fluid collection tray under the differential to catch the differential fluid that will flow out. Unscrew the drain plug using a ratchet and a 3/8" square socket. Start the process with the ratchet. And finish it off by hand. Using a ratchet and a 10mm socket, unscrew the 12 bolts holding the differential cover. Remove the differential cover. Let the fluid run out for about 10 minutes. Remove the used seal. In order to work with the differential, you must manually put the vehicle in neutral. To do this, use a Torx T15 screwdriver to remove the plastic cover located above the parking brake. Remove the plastic cover. Using a fork, disengage the shifter cable from the shifter lever. Then, pull the shifter cable to put the vehicle in the neutral position. You can now freely rotate the rear axle in order to access the pinion shaft lock bolt. To prevent the differential from rotating when unscrewing the lock bolt, return the shifter cable to the park position. Using a 10mm wrench, unscrew the lock bolt from the pinion shaft. Then remove it. Pull the shifter cable again to put it in the neutral position. Rotate the rear axle shaft in order to access the pinion shaft. You can now extract the pinion shaft. Rotate the differential to access the retaining clip. Return the shifter cable to the park position. The retaining clip is very difficult to remove. To remove it, don't hesitate to hit the end of the rear axle shaft hard with a sledgehammer. This will create the space needed to remove the clip. Remove the clip using a magnetic extender. You can now remove the rear axle shaft. We recommend using a slide hammer. Even with this tool, removing the axle shaft can be a long and painstaking process. You now have access to the rear axle seal and to the rear axle bearing. Using a screwdriver, pry out the rear axle seal until it can be rotated into its housing. You can use a hammer to help you. Then remove it. You can now see the rear axle bearing. In order to remove the rear axle bearing, you must have the proper equipment, which in this case is a bearing removal tool. Insert the moving part behind the bearing. Then using the bolt, press the washer on the outer part of the bearing to lock the tool. Secure the tool on a slide hammer. Then extract the rear axle bearing by tapping with a slide hammer. However, it is often difficult to remove. Protect the bearing slot with a clean cloth. There are several techniques. In our case, we first used a heat gun and penetrating oil. Then we had to use a milling cutter to cut around the bearing frame. Before fitting the rear axle bearing back on, you must clean the seal surface to ensure it is completely impermeable. Clean the location with a vacuum. For great content, our best price, and fast shipping, download the CarParts.com app now. Finish with brake cleaner and wipe with a paper towel. Use the link in the description to order the rear axle bearing that is used in the video on CarParts.com. Apply assembly grease to facilitate the installation of the new bearing. Attention! The bearing must be inserted properly. Ensure that you are inserting the side of the bearing that is more rounded on the differential side. The shape of this side facilitates insertion. Place the new rear axle bearing in its position. Then, use a bearing installation tool and a hammer to drive the bearing all the way to the stop in its position. Clean the seal surface with brake cleaner and a paper towel. Take the new seal. Apply assembly grease to facilitate the installation. Then, fit the rear axle seal into its position. Use the bearing installation tool and the hammer to finalize the installation. Take the rear axle shaft and insert it all the way into its slot. Then reinsert the retaining clip. You can use pliers. Then pull on the axle shaft to block the retaining clip in its housing so that you can insert the pinion shaft. Reinsert the pinion shaft. Pull the shifter cable again to put it in the neutral position. Rotate the axle shaft so that you can replace the lock bolt. Return the shifter cable to the park position. On this vehicle, the lock bolt tends to break in the differential. We therefore advise you to replace it with a new one. Then put the lock bolt back in place, first by hand, then with a 10mm wrench. Finish tightening using a torque wrench. Put the shifter cable back in place on the shifter lever. Replace the plastic cover. Then screw it back on. Clean the seal surface with brake cleaner and a paper towel. Then scrub with fine sandpaper. Finish with brake cleaner and wipe with a paper towel. Repeat the same operations on the differential. Once perfectly clean, put the new gasket in place. Replace the differential cover. First tightening the bolts by hand. Then screw them back in with a ratchet until they make contact. Finish tightening the bolts in staggered order using a torque wrench. Insert the ABS sensor into its housing. Then retighten the retaining bolt. Finish tightening using a torque wrench. Now you can put the rear brake system back in place. To do so, we recommend watching our video, How to Replace the Rear Brakes Chevy Silverado. Then you will be able to put the wheels back on your vehicle. Now you need to add fluid back into the differential. This step must be done with care and precision. First, lower your truck back onto the ground, as the differential fluid must be filled with the vehicle flat. Then, using an oil syringe or a bottle with a filling spout, fill the differential until the fluid overflows from the hole. indicating that you have added enough fluid to the differential. Clean the differential's filler cap well because it is magnetic and there is often grime left on it. Now you can screw the filler cap back on. Finish tightening using a torque wrench. Clean up the fluid that overflowed from the differential. Block the wheels properly. Operation complete.